Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rivera. I'm editor for Latin America at Global Voices. And today we'll be talking about Colombia's peace process together with my co-editor, Laura Vidal, and also three panelists who are joining us. Robert Valencia, Global Voices author and political analyst, and also National Urban Fellow. Diego Osorio, advisor, consultant, and researcher at Raoul Dandurand Chair in Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at Université de Quebec in Montreal, and also at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies.
Hello, everyone.
And Andres Lombana Bermudez, who's researcher and designer at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University.
Hello.
So, well, yesterday it was a historic day in Colombia. A peace agreement was finally signed after war between the FARC and the government. And I would love for Diego or Andres or Robert, whoever wants to jump in, to give us a little bit of context on why is this such an important day, and why are all Colombians very happy or very attentive about what's going to happen.
Okay, well, if you allow me, I just want to start by saying that this is such an important day because no Colombian that's alive today was born before the beginning of this conflict. Basically, it's 52 years in the current phase of the conflict, 52 years in which you had these guerrillas that evolved into what is now known as the FARC, Popular Army of Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, but also because it's a conflict that, because of the nature and the historical origins, had learned to live within the structures of the country. So everybody got used to it. It's inside themselves. It's part of their day-to-day reality. So the fact that this conflict has now ended means that even people that could not imagine peace are now going through it. And that in itself is quite a unique situation. Most of the conflicts that we know, and even the Second World War, we're talking 10 to 15 years maximum. This one is 52. So it's quite a unique achievement. And the second element that is to the credit of most Colombians is that although certain geostrategic factors allow for the existence of this peace process, it is made in Colombia. Colombians made it happen. Colombians figured out a way around it, and they were able to build the channels for negotiations. So that in itself is quite a remarkable achievement. So those two things make it very special.
So, but how did this conflict start? I mean, it's 52 years, and a lot of stories have passed, a lot of stories from the rural areas, a lot of stories from citizens in cities. How did it evolve? How did it came to this end?
Well, there have been conflicts in Colombia in the rural areas through most of the 19th century as well as the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, you had the civil wars between the federalist and the centralist vision in Colombia. Then you had conflicts between different departments because Colombia was a big country. It was very decentralized, and the communication patterns were very difficult. So basically, you had states in the north declaring independence and states in the south declaring a new constitution, and that was basically politics as usual through most of the 19th century. You had a huge conflict called the War of the 1,000 Days at the beginning of the 20th century, which had one important factor. It really started showing the complexity between the federal and the centralist forces, and that also led to dismemberment of the Colombian territory, because that's when Panama came to be. Because usually because of this conflict, there was an intervention from the United States, and therefore Panama became an independent country. You had conflicts like that happening, taking different shapes. It was usually either ideological or based on different conceptions of the state. And let's just say that from the moment we had most of the social conflicts in the 30s and the 30s and the 20s in Colombia, you start having a bit of an ideological 20th century shape to it. So You had the conflicts that Gabriel Garcia Marquez described in 1,000 Years of Solitude, the massacres in the banana plantations. And that led to a situation in which the social fabric in Colombia has been very robust, but not necessarily very fair nor very equal. And then we have one benchmark, which is 1948. There was a very charismatic leader that was promoting social change, that had a discourse of social democratic reforms, maybe a bit too soon for his own time, and he was killed. And this led to something called El Bogotazo, which was a major political upheaval, and it was a violent situation. During that time, that led to a more institutionalized view of how the different actors in Colombia were fighting with each other. And that conflict in itself was what we consider today the genesis of the situation that led to, first, self-defense forces from people from the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, that eventually, because of economic and ideological pressures, transformed themselves into the communist guerrillas that led to the M19, FARC, LN, and other guerrillas that happen in Colombia. So basically, in any place where you have injustice, where you don't have structural patterns for change, that led to a conflict, and that's what we have today.
If I can just jump in here, because I have a little question for whoever would like to answer. Maybe Robert, you can help us with this, because we're having questions from our viewers. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share with you. Here it is. Yeah, I'm going to share with you a tweet from our dear Juan Tadeo, who's a Global Voices author from Mexico. He says, "I do believe that Mr. Uribe has a point when he compares the FARC to Mexican drug cartels." So this is definitely not, I guess, the way in which the FARC wanted to be known. I wonder if you could explain to us a little bit about how the FARC evolved to be seen this way.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that tweet, to be honest with you. Comparing FARC with the Mexican cartels, it's a little bit too much of a stretch for one big reason. Since the inception of FARC, they had a political purpose. Mexican drug cartels do not have a political purpose. The only purpose is to make money. You will never see, or you've never seen, rather, El Chapo Guzman, for example, running for political office like Pablo Escobar did at the moment. So I think that is the big difference. You don't see, Mexican drug cartels as violent and bloodthirsty as they are. You will never see them, bombing cities or, killing people in droves. I mean, there's definitely a violence component, but the genesis of each, group it's some quite different. Now, I like to add something that Diego was talking about, the inception of guerrillas, and we cannot forget the Cuban Revolution of the late 1950s. I think that was something that brought some hope of change across the continent. And you had groups in Peru as well. You had the Shining Path. You had other guerrillas in other countries in Central America, Colombia, obviously, and also the political environment in the 1950s as well, when you have the M19, an extant group that was formed after the elections, and I believe, and Diego can correct me, I believe this was back in the 1970s or 1960s when president at the time, it was Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, was trying to seek re-election, and he thought that the elections, I believe in 1969, were rigged, and on April 19th, and that's when the M19 movement came to be. But going back to the tweet, I believe that you cannot make that type of comparison with Mexican drug cartels. Now, obviously, FARC have raked in millions of dollars thanks to the illicit trade. So and that's when you can believe that you will believe that FARC has lost its purpose, because the purpose is not just to bring social equity or become an active actor in the political arena. They just became just like the drug dealers in Colombia, making money, selling cocaine to international markets, profiting from kidnapping and abducting people who are who are well off. Or so definitely that would be a great comparison, but the genesis of both groups are not the same in my opinion.
Yeah, I would like to add also, like, in the genesis of the FARC guerrillas is this this problem of the land distribution. So these people is like farmers, and like in the 50s, with this violence between the two parties, the liberal and the conservatives, they emerged from farmers who are liberal, and they start to create these areas of the guerrilla, like in frontier lands, like borderlands, where they can live. And then they emerge after an attack of the government in 1964, I guess, if I am not wrong, at Marquetalia. And then they declare, after that attack, they go in different directions, and is when the founders of the FARC declare, like, okay, we are going to start the FARC as they are now. Or I think it was called Bloque Sur. But, I mean, how they evolved to become this tweet that compares them as narcos, right? Or as Uribe and other people in Colombia. They evolved precisely because the war in Colombia becomes sustainable through narco traffic, and it's what happened in the 80s. So it's just like the origins are like these farmers trying to fight for political participation, for land redistribution, like rural reforms and agrarian reform that never has happened in Colombia before. But in the 80s, just like the narcotraffic as a global phenomena enters the country, finding like a great setting, a great stage for not only cultivation and production of drugs, like especially cocaine, but also marijuana, the origins, but also for like building these laboratories, like for processing the drug, and just like a lot of a clandestine network of transportation. That if you think of how the landscape of a tropical country with 3 mountains, with a geography that is very complex, can be set up or can be the stage for this kind of production of drugs and also for war, is perfect, right? I think it's a very interesting twist that happened in the 80s, and that is also why the guerrillas evolved in that direction, like scale, make the conflict not only like worse violently in terms of violence and tax and resources and arms, but also make it very profitable and sustainable. So, yeah.
So I have a question. How does the country live for 52 years in war? How does it, how is daily life in the rural areas? How is daily life in the cities? How does this keep going on and evolving until this day?
Well, violence has coexisted with the day-to-day lives of Colombians probably from the beginning. I mean, this whole notion that Colombia was a peaceful place, well, you have to go back and see the history books. You have war after war in the 19th century. Then you have the early 20th century. You have violence of different types. I mean, ownership of the land, access to the means of productions, access to a bare minimum of justice and the hope of a better life, it wasn't necessarily given to all Colombians. So that is happening. And so therefore, this violence has taken on different shapes and form. What is new about the FARC, and that relates to the question with the drug cartel, is that it's an instrument of, the FARC is bent or was bent on using violence as a way to access political power. That's not something that happened with drug cartels and other actors. And the fact is that the FARC were able to exist in certain parts of Colombia. It's just recently, I mean, relatively speaking, in the 52 years of the conflict, that the FARC were actually able to raise the hand and bring the war to the urban areas. Most of the times it just existed in certain patches of the entire country. You could have different realities within the same country. What happens in the south doesn't even relate to what happens in Chocó, the areas where you have a lot of African Colombian population. And so during most of the 20th century, you could basically have a more or less normal Latin American life in most of the cities and the core of the country. And whatever you happen in terms of insurgency wouldn't really affect your day-to-day. We're talking 1990s, early part of the 21st century, where you're actually seeing the FARC taking over and actually making it a very difficult situation. And that's when you have Uribe and you had the response. But it was just recent. And so Colombia developed mechanisms in which the economy, the modes of production and everything else live and accounted for the losses created by this insurgency. And it's because that was still a good economic calculus that they were able to keep on growing for most of the 20th century and even from the 21st century. What happens is that now with the beginning of this internationalization, globalization, the fact that Colombia had a war actually became a factor in terms of losing a competitive edge vis-a-vis other Latin American countries. And that is, we will see that later, that is part of the reasons why we actually get to the point of having peace. But it's just a matter of recent stuff. And as I said, Colombians, any Colombian alive today was born in a country that had a civil war, and it had it for most of the time. So it's just a matter of living with that, and the people realize to just have coping mechanisms to coexist with the fact that you have conflict.
If there's something that I like to add from Diego's point, which I think is very important, is the political participation of FARC. And we need to also understand that this is not the first time that Colombia has sought a peace agreement with FARC, being the largest guerrilla in the country. And I'm going to cite the example of La Uribe, which was the most representative peace process that supposedly gave political participation to FARC. And one example is Unión Patriótica, the UP, which was the party that was born out of this conversation, and Diego can definitely correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that is where the FARC has the upper hand. What do I mean by this? When they became a political movement, they were persecuted tremendously. Many of the people who belonged to that party were annihilated. You have Jaime Pardo Leal, who was a very important leader back in the 80s. He was assassinated. You have Bernardo Jaramillo Osa, who was a political candidate in the 1990s. He was killed by the right-wing paramilitaries. You have people like Aida Bello, Manuel Cepeda. You can name all these people. Even Ivan Marquez, the guy who signed up the peace agreement yesterday, he was part of the UP, part of the Unión Patriótica, and he went back to the jungle. So what is important at this stage is that now that the guerrillas are going to have political participation, my biggest concern is that if we do not come to terms surrounding the peace agreement, my biggest fear, and I hope I'll be wrong on this, is that there's going to be more political persecution. You see this with the M19 when Antonio Navarro Wolf, who was a guerrilla member, he's a successful politician today, but many of them face a lot of opposition. You have Gustavo Petro, who was mayor of Bogota, and he was also part of the guerrillas, and he faced starch criticism. I'm not saying that he did a great job, but many of his policies were criticized, and the fact that he was part of that guerrilla, he was criticized for that. So I feel that the most important thing about the peace agreement that was signed yesterday is not just a piece of paper that was signed. I think the biggest challenge for many Colombians today is going to be tolerance and being able to understand that this is a pluralistic society where everybody have different ideas, and yes, that include that of the FARC. Otherwise, Colombia is going to engulf itself in another conflict, internal conflict.
Okay, yeah, I think that point is extremely important and very interesting, and I would really like to connect it to end up with this part in which we're trying to contextualize the conflict. I would really like if you could tell me a little bit, who are these people that belong to the guerrilla? Because we're talking right now, we're talking about the big faces and the names that sort of jumped into the public arena, the political arena. I wonder, since there are so many stories about the victims, there are also some stories about the young people getting into guerrilla groups. I would really like it if you could tell us a little bit, who are these people? Why do they join? What are their reasons? And have these reasons evolved? Do they join the guerrilla groups voluntarily? Do they know what they're doing? And then what happens when they reintegrate the society?
Well, in all fairness, go ahead. Robert?
I think Andres hasn't. I don't know. I'm not delegating.
We should hear from Andres and then Diego, and then we come back to you.
I am actually not that aware of like how the motives, right? I mean, I haven't actually. It's interesting. I have heard stories from people who has joined the reconciliation program, for instance, who have been in the guerrillas and how they are recruited. Many times they are recruited by force. And just because they live in these areas that start to be controlled by the FARC. So this is stories from people who are like school teachers or try to kind of work in education or trying to work with youth and are recruited to work with the FARC. And also there are the stories of like these towns in rural areas where the FARC enters and recruits like children and women. So, but that's something that I don't know by first hand. So I don't think like I'm the most appropriate in the most. I don't think they have the information to say like who are they. I think most of them are farmers and come from rural areas. Some of them could come from the cities, like as these kind of urban militias that sometimes are associated with these. Like slums in cities like in Bogota, for instance, Ciudad Bolivar, it's supposed to be like a focus of this kind of militias. And also like in some public universities, sometimes the protests, for instance, of the students are kind of framed as if they were also supported by the FARC. But I don't really know who they are. For me, for instance, as a Colombian, it's still unknown. And what I know is very little.
Okay, Diego,
may I just add a few? Yeah, I just want to add a few things. I mean, it's important to be able to accept the fact that some people do support the FARC, and it's a matter of perspective. I mean, there are parts of Colombia where they are a legitimate actor, as far as how a lot of people see it. So many people oppose it. So you have different groups. Let's just say that who were the FARC? You will have what happens in any guerrilla war. You have young urban intellectuals from the universities who decide to join the armed struggle as a way to change the situation. That's very typical and happen in many places. You have rural populations that saw the FARC as the only way to have a mechanism of either protection or a mechanism of social progress. I mean, put it this way, if you're in a part of Colombia where nothing happens, you're isolated, you don't have public services, you're really in the middle of nowhere as far as the rest of the world is concerned, and you see some guys walking down the street with guns, they have power, they have capacity, they have respect. That is the only option, you will join that, you know? It is also true that they have recruited minors, they have recruited people against their will, they will have forceful recruitment coming to certain areas and just say that all the young men and women of a certain age, you come with us, or at least one from the family, or we just kill you, whatever. All these things are true. But you couldn't sustain a guerrilla just on the basis of forceful recruitment, okay? We have to come to terms with that. And And within the layers of who joined what, you will say that even those, and you see it now in the demobilization processes, some of those who actually were forcefully recruited find within the guerrillas a mechanism that gives them certain structure in their lives. They learn to read and write, or they will learn to have certain traits. I mean, demobilization reconstruction will present certain challenges. But in the absence of state and in the absence of opportunities, in some cases, this becomes the opportunity. Now, let's go back to the urban areas. You had, the FARC is not just a rural force. They also had a very robust urban clandestine cells, and some of them dormant cells, if you want to call it, people from the Partido Comunista Colombiano Clandestino, and these were the underground Communist Party of Colombia. And they basically just maintain the connection between the rural and the urban areas. And military intelligence is really going after them for many years, and still the structures were there. Then you also have the drug trafficking. That is true. And the trafficking leads to a situation in which former people that were doing all sorts of things in the crime, they see that joining an organized force has a certain effect. And so it's a back and forth, it's a revolving door. So you do have all sorts of representative populations in the guerrillas. And what you have at the end is a force that today is mostly rural, but that it has as well a very strong urban component in terms of at least at the cadre, at the leadership.
Let me just jump in very quickly to try to invite you to move a little bit forward and reflect on how difficult is making peace. I have a quote that I think is very interesting that says, "Making peace is harder than making war," because by Stevenson, right? Because you need to put all these things together in order to compromise a little part of your ideas to imagine a country, in this case, together. So, of course, there are some examples around the world of recent peace processes that maybe Colombians can take some or not. We have the Irish peace process, we have Liberia, we have South Africa. I mean, is there something there on how to make this peace process really come to productive end? How do you get all these pieces together? How do you work together? How do you imagine this Colombia taking all these examples?
If I may address your question, it's a negotiation, and as the word implies, you have to negotiate. You have to, give up some of the things that you want in order to reach a negotiation. And obviously, the point of contention between Colombians, the guerrillas, and the government is political participation, and the fact that some of the members, at least the rank and file of the FARC, will not go through a trial, for all the crimes that they have committed in the past. But most particularly is the political participation that the peace agreement is addressing. One example is, the fact that from now till 2018, there's going to be 3 spokespeople just expressing and voicing their concerns to the Congress without the ability or the right to vote on decisions. They will not do the decision making for the next 3 years. From 2018 till 2026, there's going to be 5 seats in the Senate and 5 seats at the House of Representatives, and then they will have they can vote on issues that concern them. Then from 2026 onwards, they just have to win the votes of the Colombian people, and I think that's where Colombians could definitely defeat FARC if that's what they choose to. Now, if you compare it to other peace accords across the world, in my opinion, and I don't know if the other panelists will agree, this is very complete. if you think about it, the fact that this peace process, this peace agreement is going to go through a plebiscite is a big victory. FARC did not want the Colombian people to choose whether the peace process will be approved or disapproved. They're giving away their weapons. They're laying off the weapons. They pledged not to crop coca leaves and continue with the business of drug trafficking. And in the scheme of things, if you look at the number of political participation that FARC is going to have, is very grim compared to other processes. I'm not sure if it's Nigeria or Nepal where they signed this peace agreement. Some of the petitions or the asks from the insurgency was, we won between 60 and 80 seats in the Senate, and I think this was the case of Nepal and Nigeria, and we won the vice presidency. So it's a bargain compared to other processes. And obviously the discussion that Colombia is going to become another Marxist, or is going to become a Castro Chavista country, meaning that it's going to incorporate the ideals and the the way Cuba and Venezuela conducts their own business, and that is going to replicate in Colombia. It's also a little bit of a stretch. I believe that surely the fact that there's a political participation in Colombia, it's of high concern, and I understand and I agree with some of the points that people who reject the peace accord say. I agree with some of those points, but at the end of the day, I feel that it's a peace negotiation. You had to negotiate some things, but I feel it's more complete than some of the peace agreements that have taken across the world.
Yeah, I would add that this peace process that just happened during the past 4 years is not the first one that the government has tried with the FARC. So there are like at least 8 different occasions where they tried, and it didn't work. I think the context of this new peace process, especially like with these laws for the victims, and like this context also based in an international kind of a law for reparations and transnational justice, created a framework. I think this is why it's so important that the historical framework that this peace process has had has allowed them to come to terms. And if you listen to the evolution of the guerrillas in these 4 years, their discourse has changed. If you listen to, even if they are still stuck in this Marxist communist kind of framework, that you listen to them and you feel like, oh, they are still talking from the 60s. At least they are now thinking like political participation is possible, building democracy is possible, land reform and actually helping the farmers is possible. And I think it's not perfect in terms of perhaps what some people say, like, oh, they are going to be, they'll give them an award because they are not going to be in jails. But similarly to the South African peace process, for instance, it is a negotiation where the justice is more like something that is like in terms of reconciliation and knowing the truth. And it's not going to involve jail, but involves these guerrilla fighters and armies giving the arms and also testifying and help they identify the whole network, because this is also something that we didn't discuss, but there is a whole network in the guerrilla that is not even just the soldiers, but there are like people, owners of land that are controlled by the guerrilla. So there is a very complex system, like people who is not actually in the guerrilla, but work in this whole network of like drug production, like land production as well of crops. So it's I think it's a peace process that, even if it's not perfect for many things, is the best one. And just to say, like, making peace is harder, but even as Elizabeth was mentioning, it's harder, but even harder than making peace is actually to build peace. That is what we will have to do as a country in the next 20 years, 50 years. This is just a small step. I don't feel like it's by all, it's a process. We will see. It's a challenge for the society. It's a big social problem that we will have to solve if we want to become more like a democracy and being more tolerant and learning to solve our problems through political discourse, dialogue, and not through arms.
May I say one thing here is an important thing I have found in Colombia is the conceptual isolation that some people have about this problem. What do I mean by that? To many people in Colombia, the conflict, the reasons, the why, when, how of that conflict is unique. So nothing that has happened before or after could be compared to the Colombian case. And that is something that has to be broken, because it's just by understanding that your situation is not unique, that there are other solutions, that guerrillas were able to get elected, that guerrillas were able to have a government, that you actually break those barriers and you accept that a peace process is possible. Because if you think that your problem is unique, you think that nobody has the solution, and therefore it's unsolvable, and that's not right. So for instance, as soon as you start mentioning to people in Colombia that in El Salvador, you had already 2 guerrilla-based governments, and they were as incompetent as the ones from the right-wing side, well, it normalizes things. When you compare to, as you mentioned, Nepal, that, the gains and the losses and what you have to compromise are certainly not comparable to the rest, it takes a lot of strength out of those arguments. The problem is that maybe because of language or because of media concentration, most of the Colombian population doesn't really have these kind of alternative mechanisms of information. So you get the news from 2 or 3 main outlets, and most of the people just are basically part of that polarization, and that is a problem. That is a huge problem. The other thing is that it's also important to understand that in the case of Colombia, you have many layers of different types of conflicts coexisting with each other. And so it's not that you can compare only to Liberia, as you mentioned, because the kind of violence and sadistic attacks on the civilian population you have in Colombia. You have a bit of everything. You had a bit of Nepal. You had a bit of Sri Lanka. You had Rwanda. You had the typical guerrilla wars of the Malaysia or Cuba. At the end of the day, the complexity of the country lends itself to the complexity of this own particular situation. So what was important was to have this open mind that some negotiators and people that designed the process were able to go and see how certain things compared to each other and get pieces of it. We needed to work in terms of how do we negotiate while we keep fighting. Well, it's possible. And you learn from the Irish experience. It is also true that today, if you really want to look at successful peace processes, well, you don't have many. and basically we have to rely on the political solutions of the Central American ones that show how certain things could be solved, but they're not a perfect example because the post-political situation is a disaster. And you have the Irish process showing that reconciliation and the building of empathy is important. And the final element I want to mention is that Colombians need to, and some of them have understood, but many people still not really close to that notion, is that this was not the end of a conflict by military means. They were using military means to bring people to a negotiating point. Because people in certain parts of Colombia say, well, why is it that they don't just request forgiveness? Why is it that they get in these things? Because we're convincing them to get out of the mountains and be part of the political process. Otherwise, you will have to force them. And to force them, that's 20 more years of war, more people dying, and more fighting, which will be very difficult. Some people in Colombia really think that the conflict was at the point of the Sri Lankan conflict, which the Tamil tigers were completely exterminated in one beach. But that was just one case, and Colombia was not in any way close to that point. Mm-hmm. And so the final thing is the communication of the process itself was not well done. I mean, I have to say that in terms of the design of the peace process, it's a masterpiece, but the communication is really not that good. And that is a problem because people will need to understand things such as we're building peace for our grandchildren. This is a negotiation. This is not a victory. Yeah, it is a victory because you use military means to force the other to change his attitude and change his points. And not using your weapons is also a way of using your military advantage. but at the end of the day, it's a negotiated thing. And so that is essential to keep in mind.
Can I add one last thing? I think it's such an important point, and I think it dovetails to what Diego is saying. The matter of peace in Colombia is a moral one. Moral is such an important issue here because as Latinos, as you know, we tend to be very moral. You know, that comes from the Catholic background that we have. And the idea is that there has to be punishment. There has to be justice. And with justice comes wrath, the wrath of God. You know, you cannot go unpunished because of your wrong, because you did a wrongdoing, you had to be punished. Of course, I'm not condoning lack of punishment for crimes against humanity. But it's a moral issue because it has to come from forgiveness. And as Diego was saying, you can force people to apologize and ask for forgiveness. But this is very important because even there was a meeting between the FARC and families from the Valle del Cauca deputies who were killed in I believe this was 2002. And they had these sessions where they sat down and they had this, they had the right to call them assassins, that, you cannot judge them for that. But there was a moment of reconciliation. And I believe that peace, the way we can build peace is starting with yourself as a Colombian. You had to make a self-assessment and say, if I carry this hate within me, there's not going to be peace. There's going to be always this us versus them approach, and then war will continue. And it's also important to mention that just because we just signed a peace agreement, it is not the end of war per se. We have other groups like ELN or the National Liberation Army that clearly opposed to this peace agreement with FARC. They said, we respect your decision, but we do not share it. And as a matter of fact, they mentioned that they're going to have a military strike and blocking, roads across the country. So it is not the silver bullet for all the problems in Colombia. However, is the first step forward. And that's what we should all celebrate at the end of the day.
Okay, so yes, this is a process, and as we've learned, the peace agreement was signed. Now the people have agree on that signature or not. That's the referendum that's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And then what? What happens if the people say, yes, we agree with this, and we are finally come to terms, and we can imagine, a way forward? What happens if there's a no? How do you see it, Andres? How do you see the moving on after this specific agreement and referendum?
Yeah, I think if the steps are like if the yes wins in the referendum, then there is this process of implementation that, I mean, it's also very complex, but it needs to, for instance, there is a process where the guerrillas are going to be concentrated in certain areas. These areas where this is going to be a special under special jurisdictions, and where they are going to be participate in these councils, or telling the truth, or be judged, give the arms. There are also certain kind of implementations at the level of law. Several projects, I'm not sure the number, but maybe 7 projects or 10 projects need to be passed the Congress. So even if the agreement is signed, it's still like the Congress of Colombia has to debate a lot of these things. It's not totally, it's not like immediately all the things that are signed are going to be implemented. Then there is like all these processes, for instance, the land reform. So it will take, it's involving several actors, international actors giving money for replacement of drug crops or narco crops, and changing them for another kind of crops that are like more sustainable, helping the farmers. There are like funds that are going to come from inside Colombia. One of the controversial issues is like it needs to subsidize these farmers who have been like growing like coca, for instance, and change their crops for other ones that are productive. There are like several things related to the agreement that need to be implemented. If the no wins, I feel like the FARC already say they are not gonna renegotiate it, as some of the promoters of the no say like, oh no, we have to vote no, so then we can renegotiate the agreement. So that's not gonna happen. So I just feel like it's going back to war. so I think that's what could happen with the no, and perhaps, of course, as Ricardo was mentioning, with the possibility of the no, what will happen is like people in the right wing, people who want to maintain this war, because it's also very profitable in terms of political power and economic power, they will actually intensify their attacks to people who is more tolerant, more diverse, more pluralistic. That we have seen it already. There, I mean, across the war, also like it's across the ideologies of being tolerant, being diverse. So politicians who want to be progressive perhaps are going to be like put in a very bad position, and the society who wants to change, the young people who is looking for building a country that is more pluralistic and democratic.
There's one thing, is that President Santos was being political about getting this referendum or plebiscite, okay? But he was already mandated to, and he has the ability to move forward with the agreement as it is. It's not politically advisable, but it's legally doable. And so if by any chance there is a no victory, he can still go with the peace agreement. And then what we're going to have is a presidential election basically focused on the peace agreement. It will be a pro-peace and an anti-peace agreement candidates. And the polarization is going to go even deeper. Certainly, it's going to be far more difficult to maintain the difficult compromises that were taken to make this peace agreement happen. But senior membership in the FARC has said that even if the no wins, they don't really see it going back to active fighting. You will have a very gray zone that will lend itself to a lot of difficult situations. But the pressure of the international community and other factors will come up with some sort of a typical whitewashing solution so that the process continues. I mean, I don't really see this as a Brexit situation, or it will be like a Brexit. You know, people argue that they will never going to get out of the European Union. They're just going to keep it going like that in a gray zone. Some people will benefit from that. Now, it is also true that we haven't mentioned it here, is that these peace agreements, they all have an economic skeleton, okay? And people want to have a certain sense of legacy. At the end of the day, we all want to have some sort of a, what are we leaving behind? And those two key elements, in my opinion, guarantee that at least with this FARC, there will be some sort of a peace process either through A, B, C options. These fellows who signed, Timoshenko, he doesn't want to die in the mountains fighting, okay? He doesn't want to die like Regis, or he doesn't want to die like Khan. That's for sure. So there will be ways around that. The second element on that regard is that there has been some dialogues in the Havana between people from the economic sectors in Colombia and the FARC, because you had to do a bit of a walking them out of the ideological conceptualization of the world to a more pragmatic one. So now they accept issues such as cooperatives, collective production, but accepting elements of the capitalist system. So they will not agree on everything, but there is certainly now a certain sense of pragmatism embedded into the thinking of the FARC, and that will keep the peace initiative working, even in the event of a no. I read today that it's 55 to 26. So that you have an empty space there that is difficult to explain. But even if the no wins, this will not be the end 100%. I don't think so.
Okay, so I just to wrap up, I just want to throw an idea to you. Said about the peace agreement being a masterpiece, but not very well communicated. What went wrong in that communication? What went well? And if you have a final thought to share, that'd be great. Robert?
Well, I think obviously you had the figure of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who was the president of Colombia between 2002 and 2010, who has been portrayed as the Colombian savior. And a lot of Colombians are grateful for his administration and the way he conducted the country after the failed Caguán peace talks with the guerrilla, because that's another factor that we have to consider. Prior to Uribe taking office in 2002, you had the Caguán peace talks in 1999 that were a complete failure. So you have this person who is, the savior of the country, and obviously he's vociferous against the peace process, and he has done a lot of propaganda around the no, meaning you should not vote in favor of the peace process. So that's probably why the no propaganda has stifled the yes campaign, the yes propaganda, if you call it like that. So I feel that the fact that there was a lot of secrecy during the peace process in Havana, and that's why they picked Cuba, because Cuba, has a way to restrict, all these things to go out in the light. So, and Diego is laughing because I guess he agrees with me. But I feel that there was a lot of secrecy going on, and I think that people were not really clear about what's going on. My last reflection on this is just that peace is a personal matter. It is the first step, and I think that's my final reflection, is that we signed a historic agreement, but this is the first step of a road that is going to be very treacherous. And if Colombians don't come to terms, I don't know if there's going to be everlasting peace. There won't be an everlasting peace if there's still a lot of resentment coupled with social inequality. Colombia has the largest rate of inequality, social inequality in Latin America. And those things need to be addressed, because that is the perfect scenario to create new armed groups and outlaws in the country. So those things had to be addressed. Social inequality and lack of economic opportunities. Those two things are key to really maintain peace in a country like Colombia.
Thank you, Robert. How about you, Andres? Any thoughts?
Yes, just to build on what Richard just said, I agree that the political context, especially this opposition between Centro Democrático Álvaro Uribe Vélez versus Santos, it's just like it has been like even before like the peace process started, already like building this kind of opposition based in insults, in misinformation, a lot of like lies, and that created an environment of mistrust. So basically the trust that we would be perfect for building this peace process never existed. So the people never got together in a single movement. They were not like, in other processes sometimes you get like this mass movement pro peace. That hasn't happened in Colombia. Even yesterday with the signing, it was never massive. And when somebody tried to do that, like for instance, Santana Smoke, who's mobilizing the peace, the marches in Colombia, then it was there Uribe and all these people saying, oh, that's just like propaganda, that they have been hired by the president. This is just part of the same Castro Chavismo. So it's just like a systematic attack and misinformation to build this environment of mistrust that didn't allow the people to come together around peace. And I think it was I mean, we will see how it progresses, but I think we will need to come to terms and come together as a society and reconciliate, basically, and work together to build a Colombia that is more democratic and participatory.
Thank you, Andres. How about you, Diego?
Okay.
Your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, I just want to say one thing is that I've been working with the United Nations, the World Bank on peace and conflict in many places. And if I can just say the following, this is the only case in which I see a positive way out. I mean, I've been to so many others, and it's basically at the best just keeping the patient alive. This patient can just walk away from the hospital. Only Colombians just get their act together. Why? Because peace in Colombia is possible. The human capital of this country is unique. They have the ability to transform this country into something from a middle-income developing country to something that could kick the ass of places like Portugal, Spain, or even middle-income countries in the European Union. It can be done, you know. It's just that the main problem with the situation in Colombia is the distrust and the ability to organize themselves. There's a lot of fractures in society because of social issues, because the injustice. The Colombian society is very, very unequal. It's extremely unequal, and that we're only going to breed injustice. So peace is possible. It's proven because if you compare it to other places, you see all the conditions to make it happen in Colombia, because Colombians have the capital, because Colombians made this peace possible, and because Colombians got it so close that it would be crazy, just to finalize it. That's one thing. Geostrategically, because if you only look at the case of Colombia and just listen to the news and what President Uribe says and President Santos says, you see that the world gravitates around Colombia, and that's not true. But if you really realize what is happening around the world, you will see that Colombia is what they call a very low-hanging fruit in terms of the peace process. It's almost there, 100%. Compared to Syria, compared to Africa, compared to the situation in the Middle East, it is completely doable, right? And the third element is that, as Robert mentioned, there is a dimension of peace that is far more personal, which is building on that empathy. Colombians rise with reason or no reason, but at the end of the day, they are polarized. And empathy is a mental muscle that needs to be exercised. So it has to be used at every level, every day. So everything from the way they interact with each other when they have a traffic accident, or the distrust that you have in many other places, is something that has to be addressed. When you compare Latin American communities around the world, the Colombians are the least organized, the one with the less number of Colombian associations. You have Dominicans, you have Haitians, you have Peruvians. Colombians, not a lot, because that distrust is there. Maybe it's a factor of violence or whatever it is, you have a situation you have to deal with. So I'm just going to say, this peace is not just possible, it's a human duty, because if Colombians realize the role they are called to play today and in the future, they realize that they have an obligation to just show the way for the future. It's really like the country that is going to give hope to many in the future. It's giving hope today. Imagine that. It's a country of immigration. People are flying from different parts of the world and setting up shop in Colombia. So, I mean, what else do you guys need? It has to happen.
Well, thank you very much for that very optimistic closing. Say first of all, thank you to every one of you. Thank you to the audience, and also tell you that we also have many posts on Global Voices around this subject that you can always go to and share about the hashtags being used during all these conversations about how the Afro-Colombian struggle gets involved in this peace process. Also, a very, very nice post of the Urabá Diaries, that struggles of young people in Colombia's north. And so thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your thoughts, and thank you for everyone who's watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Ciao, thanks.